They say Blackridge Prison was abandoned decades ago, but if you stand close enough to its rusted gates at night, you'll hear the chains rattle and the faint, desperate whispers of men who were never meant to die. I didn't believe it. None of us did, until the night we stepped inside and learned that some places don't stay empty, and some sins refuse to be forgotten. When Mark first mentioned Blackridge Prison, I thought he was joking. "You've got to be kidding me," I said, leaning back in my chair, staring at his overly enthusiastic grin. "That place? The one with all the ghost stories?" Mark nodded, his excitement palpable. "Exactly. You wouldn't believe how much paranormal activity has been recorded there. And guess what? It's totally off limits, so we'll have the whole place to ourselves." I sighed, glancing at Alice and Tom. Alice, ever the adventurer with her camera slung across her shoulder, was already nodding in agreement. Tom, on the other hand, rolled his eyes. "You're all crazy. It's just an old crumbling building with a bunch of urban legends. But fine, count me in. Someone's got to keep you idiots grounded in reality." That's how it began. A simple invitation, delivered over a casual evening with friends, turned into a plan I couldn't seem to back out of. Mark's fascination with the paranormal wasn't new, but there was something about the way he spoke about Blackridge that unsettled me. He described the prison as though it were alive, whispering in the dark, beckoning us. The drive out was long and uneventful. The prison was tucked away in the backwoods of rural Pennsylvania, miles from any sign of civilization. As we got closer, the road narrowed, trees thickening like a tunnel, guiding us into the heart of something ancient. The air felt heavier with each mile. Mark kept talking the whole way, recounting tales he'd read about the prison. "They used to execute people here, lots of them," he said, his voice laced with grim fascination. "And not just criminals, innocent people too. False confessions, rushed trials. Blackridge became infamous for its so-called justice system. The place is cursed." "Cursed, huh?" Tom muttered, staring out the window. "I bet the only thing haunting that place is asbestos." Alice chuckled softly, but I could tell she was listening closely to Mark. I was too, though I pretended not to care. There was a weight to his words, something that lingered in the silence that followed. When we finally arrived, I couldn't help but shiver. The prison loomed before us, a skeletal structure against the fading twilight. Its tall iron gates stood ajar, rusted and creaking with every gust of wind. Beyond them, the crumbling towers and decaying walls of Blackridge looked like the remnants of a nightmare. "Well, here we are," Mark said, stepping out of the car. He sounded too cheerful, as if he wasn't fazed by the oppressive aura of the place. As I stood at the gates, staring at the darkness waiting inside, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. "Let's get this over with," I muttered, gripping my flashlight tighter than I intended. Crossing the threshold into Blackridge felt like stepping into another world. The air inside was stagnant and cold, carrying the faint metallic tang of decay. Our footsteps echoed as we moved deeper into the courtyard, where weeds had grown wild through the cracks in the pavement. The only sounds were the occasional whistle of the wind through broken windows and the soft crunch of gravel beneath our boots. The prison was massive, far larger than I'd imagined. Its towering walls seemed to close in on us, their surfaces scarred and stained by decades of neglect. I ran my hand along one, the stone rough and cold, and felt an almost electric sensation, like the place itself was alive, buzzing with dormant energy. "This is incredible," Mark whispered, almost reverently. He was already setting up his EMF meter and recorder. "Look at it. It's like the history is baked into these walls." Alice was less poetic, focusing instead on capturing everything on her camera. She moved around us in quick, deliberate steps, the faint whir of her equipment filling the silence. Tom, of course, was unimpressed. "Looks like every other abandoned building to me, except this one smells worse." He kicked a loose piece of debris, sending it skittering across the ground. "You'll feel it soon," Mark said cryptically, not bothering to look up. We pushed further inside, passing through what had once been the main entryway. The doors were barely hanging on their hinges, and the rusted metal creaked ominously when we touched them. Beyond was the central corridor, stretching out like the spine of the prison. Cells lined either side, their bars corroded and twisted. "Pick a direction," Mark said, his voice echoing. "Left or right?" "Let's just stick together," I suggested. The place was too vast, too dark to split up without getting lost. The first signs of unease crept in as we moved down the hallway. My flashlight beam barely pierced the darkness ahead, and the shadows seemed to stretch and twist unnaturally. I heard it then, a faint clink, like metal on stone. I froze, shining my light into the nearest cell. Nothing. "You okay?" Alice asked, her voice low. "Yeah," I lied, lowering the beam. But something felt wrong, as if the prison was waiting for us to go deeper. As we moved deeper into the prison, the faint noises grew more pronounced, footsteps echoing just out of sync with ours, the soft murmur of voices, and that metallic clinking that sent shivers crawling up my spine. "Do you hear that?" I asked, breaking the silence. Mark stopped, his recorder already in hand. "Of course I do," he said, grinning. "This is exactly what we came for." He raised the device and clicked it on. "Let's see if they want to talk." "This isn't funny, Mark," Alice muttered, adjusting her camera nervously. The hallway opened into a larger room, the former mess hall, judging by the rusting rows of overturned tables and the long serving counter still intact along the far wall. Mark gestured for us to stop, then pointed toward the ceiling. Above us, faint scratch marks trailed across the beams, long and jagged, like someone had been trying to claw their way out. "Great," Tom said. "Rats the size of house cats, I bet." He kicked at a pile of debris, but his usual sarcasm sounded forced. Mark ignored him, setting his equipment on one of the tables. "Let's take a minute here," he said, crouching over his recorder. "This is prime EVP territory." Alice began filming the room, while I wandered toward the far corner, drawn to a door half hidden behind a pile of collapsed furniture. My flashlight beam swept over a rusted plaque. "Execution chamber." "Guys," I called softly. My voice sounded thin, swallowed up by the oppressive silence. Mark's head snapped up. His grin widened as he read the plaque. "Oh, hell yes," he said, brushing past me to shove at the door. It groaned open reluctantly, revealing a cramped, windowless room dominated by a single object, the execution chair. Time seemed to stop. The chair stood stark in the middle of the room, its leather straps brittle and cracked, the wood darkened with age. The air was colder here, biting at my skin, and the faint metallic tang I'd noticed earlier was stronger, coppery, like blood. "This is it," Mark whispered, his excitement almost unhinged. He pulled out his EMF reader, which immediately spiked into red. "Do you see this? They're here." Alice stepped closer, her camera focused on the chair, but her hands were shaking. Then came the sound, a low, guttural groan that seemed to rise from the very walls. My flashlight flickered, and I felt something, an invisible pressure that pushed down on me, suffocating. "What the hell was that?" Tom snapped, his voice cracking. Before anyone could answer, Mark's recorder started playing back on its own, his voice replaced by a garbled, crackling hiss. Beneath it, clear as day, came a single, chilling word. "Run!" The light from Alice's camera suddenly failed, plunging us into darkness. I felt her hand grab my arm, trembling. "We need to get out of here," she whispered. Mark was still crouched by the chair, as if mesmerized. "No, wait," he said, his voice almost dreamy. "This is incredible. They're trying to communicate." He didn't get to finish. A deafening crash reverberated through the room, and the door slammed shut behind us. Panic surged. "Mark, we have to leave!" I shouted, grabbing his arm and yanking him toward the door. For once, he didn't argue, stumbling after me as we fought to force it open. When we finally burst back into the hallway, gasping for breath, I couldn't bring myself to look back. The groaning sound had stopped, but the silence was worse. It felt watchful, alive. "We're not alone in here," I muttered. No one disagreed. We didn't speak as we pushed further into the prison, each of us too rattled to say what we were all thinking. Whatever skepticism Tom had clung to was gone. He was gripping his flashlight like a lifeline, his face pale. Alice stayed close to me, her camera lowered but still recording. Mark, though shaken, seemed unable to let go of his recorder. The hallway ended in a set of heavy double doors, warped and splintered from decades of neglect. Mark hesitated, his hand hovering over the handle, then pulled the doors open with a creak that echoed into the darkness. Beyond was a massive chamber. It must have been the mess hall, or maybe a gymnasium, but the room had changed. The walls and ceiling were intact, impossibly pristine, as though time had reversed itself. Long rows of wooden benches filled the space, and at the far end, a raised platform loomed like a judge's bench in a courtroom. We froze. "What is this?" Alice whispered, her voice trembling. Mark stepped forward, drawn to the center of the room. "It's a tribunal," he said, almost in awe. Before any of us could respond, the temperature plummeted. My breath fogged in front of me, and a deep, resonant voice boomed through the room, making the walls vibrate. "The accused will stand." My heart stopped, the room filled with movement, shadows coalescing along the benches, taking form. Figures emerged, dozens of them, their faces twisted in anguish and fury. Their eyes glowed faintly, piercing the gloom, and their bodies flickered like static on an old television screen. One figure stepped forward, taller and more defined than the others. His face was gaunt, his uniform resembling that of a prison warden, though his features were distorted, his eyes hollow sockets. "You have entered sacred ground. You will answer for your sins." "We didn't mean any harm," I blurted out, my voice shaking. "We were just—" "Silence!" the warden bellowed, and the force of his voice made my knees buckle. The shadows on the benches began to chant, a low, guttural drone that reverberated through my chest. My flashlight flickered and died, leaving only the faint glow of their eyes to illuminate the room. The warden's gaze shifted to Mark first. "Mark Harris, you brought them here, knowing the dangers. You have led others to ruin before, blinded by your selfish thirst for the unknown. Do you deny it?" Mark stammered, his bravado gone. I didn't mean to hurt anyone. You seek truth at the expense of others' lives. Your guilt is undeniable." The shadows surged toward him, wrapping around his legs. He screamed, struggling against the invisible force, but it was no use. His recorder hit the ground, the static spilling from it blending with his cries. "Mark!" I shouted, reaching for him, but the warden raised a skeletal hand and I was paralyzed. "The next accused, Alice Carter." Alice whimpered as the glowing eyes fixed on her. "You abandoned those who needed you most. You turned your back on family, letting them suffer while you pursued your own ambition. Do you deny it?" "I didn't know," Alice sobbed. "I didn't know it would get that bad." The warden's voice cut through her protests. "Ignorance does not absolve guilt. Your silence condemned them." The shadows closed in on her, though not as violently as with Mark. They wrapped around her like chains, forcing her to her knees. Tom backed away, his hands raised. Number, no way. You're not dragging me into this. I don't have anything to hide. The warden turned to him, tilting his head in a slow, deliberate motion. Thomas Green, you betrayed those who trusted you, trading loyalty for gain. You profited from others' misfortunes, laughing at their pain. Do you deny it? Tom's face crumbled. It was just business. Everyone does it. I wasn't the only one. Excuses are the refuge of the guilty. The shadows enveloped him before he could say more, dragging him toward the benches where the figures waited. Then the warden's gaze fell on me. And you, the final accused, speak your name. I tried to reply, but my throat closed up. My heart pounded as I realized the shadows weren't moving toward me. They hovered, waiting. You carry guilt that festers like a wound, secrets you bury even from yourself. Do you deny it? My voice finally broke through the lump in my throat. I don't know what you mean. I haven't done anything. The warden leaned closer, his hollow eyes burning into mine. Lies. We see your heart. We know what you've done. A cold, searing pain ripped through my chest, and memories I had tried to forget clawed their way to the surface. Faces, voices, a decision I couldn't take back, no matter how much I tried to convince myself it wasn't my fault. The shadows crept closer, but they didn't touch me, not yet. The warden straightened, his gaze sweeping over the group. Judgment will be delivered. Prepare yourselves. The room went silent. Then the lights went out completely. The darkness was absolute. I couldn't see my own hands, but I could hear the others. Their breathing was ragged, uneven. Mark whimpered somewhere to my left, his voice strained with panic. "We have to get out of here," Alice said, her voice trembling. "Now!" "Shut up," Tom hissed. "They're still here. They'll hear us." But the warden's voice cut through the blackness, low and resonant. "You will not leave until judgment is passed. Run if you wish, but you cannot escape what binds you here." The sound of the chanting rose again, a guttural murmur that filled the room, seeming to come from all sides. My legs refused to move, but I forced myself to take a step, then another. My hand stretched out, hoping to find something, anything, but only cold air met my touch. A sudden light flickered, dim and ghostly, illuminating the room in brief flashes. The figures on the benches were gone, but the shadows had grown, their forms twisting and writhing along the walls like smoke. "Over here!" Alice whispered urgently, her flashlight barely flickering to life. She was pointing toward the double doors we had entered through, now barely visible in the shifting light. Mark scrambled forward, clutching at Alice's arm like a drowning man. "Don't leave me!" he begged, his earlier confidence shattered. I grabbed his other arm and began pulling him along, but Tom didn't move. "Tom, let's go!" I shouted. He shook his head, his eyes fixed on the shadows. "You heard them. There's no way out. We're dead." "There's a way," I insisted, though I wasn't sure I believed it myself. "Come on." He didn't respond. Instead, he stepped backward, his face contorted with guilt and terror. "I can't," he said, his voice cracking. "They're right. I deserve this." Before I could reach for him, the shadows swarmed. They coiled around his legs, pulling him down as he screamed. His flashlight hit the ground and rolled, casting wild beams of light across the room as the darkness consumed him. "Tom!" Alice cried, but Mark yanked her away and we ran. The hallway was a labyrinth, stretching and shifting like a living thing. Every turn brought us to the same barred doors or collapsed walls, and the air grew colder with every step. "They're playing with us," Alice whispered, tears streaming down her face. "No," Mark said breathlessly. "They're testing us." "What does that even mean?" I snapped. Mark didn't answer. He stopped abruptly, his face twisted with determination. "I know what I have to do," he said. "What?" Alice asked, her voice sharp with fear. I brought us here. This is my fault. If I stay, maybe they'll let you go." "No." I grabbed his arm, but he shook me off. "You saw what they did to Tom," Mark said, his voice steady now. "If we keep running, they'll take us all, one by one. But if I give myself up—" He trailed off, his gaze hardening. "It's the only way." Before I could argue, he turned and walked back toward the shadows. I wanted to stop him, to drag him with us, but something in his expression told me it was useless. "Mark, don't!" Alice sobbed, but he didn't look back. The shadows surged toward him, enveloping him in a swirling mass of darkness. For a moment, I thought I saw him smile. Then he was gone. "Go!" I shouted, pulling Alice by the arm. She stumbled after me, her sobs muffled by the heavy air. The shadows were closing in now, faster than before. I could feel them brushing against my skin, icy and suffocating. The double doors came into view again, just ahead, but they were shrouded in a haze of darkness. With every ounce of strength, I barreled toward them, dragging Alice behind me. The doors didn't budge at first, but then, as if the prison itself relented, they groaned open. We spilled out into the courtyard, collapsing onto the cold, cracked pavement. The air was sharp and biting, but it was real, fresh and alive. I turned to look back at the prison, half expecting the shadows to follow, but the doorway was empty. "Mark!" Alice whispered, her voice breaking. I didn't have the heart to tell her that he wasn't coming back. The night air stung my lungs as I gasped, sprawled on the cold ground of the prison courtyard. My entire body ached, and my legs felt like they could give out at any moment. Alice was beside me, shivering and silent, her hands clutching the camera that she hadn't let go of, even as we ran for our lives. For a moment, the world was eerily quiet. No footsteps, no whispers, just the sound of the wind rattling the rusted gates ahead of us, the oppressive weight of the prison, the suffocating cold that seemed to seep into my bones, was gone. But it didn't feel like we were free. I turned to look back at the doorway we had just escaped from. The heavy double doors stood ajar, dark and foreboding. It felt like the prison was watching us, waiting. "Is it over?" Alice asked, her voice barely a whisper. "I don't know," I admitted. My throat was raw, my voice trembling as much as my hands. Alice shifted, pulling herself up to sit against the crumbling wall of the courtyard. Her face was streaked with tears, her eyes hollow. "Mark. Tom." I couldn't bring myself to say anything. What could I say? That Mark's sacrifice had saved us? That Tom had deserved what happened? The truth was too raw, too impossible to process. As I tried to collect my thoughts, something glimmered in the corner of my vision. I turned sharply, but there was nothing there, just shadows stretching across the courtyard. Still, the sensation of being watched was unmistakable. "They're still here," I said under my breath. Alice's head snapped up. "What do you mean?" "I don't think it ever ends," I replied. My voice felt distant, like I was hearing someone else speak. "That place, it doesn't let you go. Not really." Alice shook her head, her grip tightening on her camera. "Number. We made it out. We're out. We're alive." But even as she said it, her voice cracked. I stood, unsteady, and pulled Alice to her feet. "We need to leave," I said. "Now." As we stumbled toward the gates, I couldn't help but glance back one last time. For a split second, I thought I saw movement, figures standing in the doorway, watching. And then I heard it, the faint clinking of chains, carried on the wind. It's been 3 weeks since we escaped Blackridge, and I still wake up in the middle of the night, gasping for breath, my ears ringing with the sound of chains. No matter how hard I try, I can't push the memories away. They linger like a shadow, creeping into every quiet moment. Alice refuses to talk about it. I called her a few times, hoping to find some kind of solace in shared experience, but she won't answer. I can't blame her. That night changed both of us, but in ways I'm not sure either of us understands yet. The worst part is the silence. Blackridge doesn't feel finished with me, and deep down, I know why. I've been trying to write everything down, hoping that putting it into words will help make sense of it. But as I do, I keep circling back to the same thought, the warden's voice, the way he looked at me, the words he said. "We see your heart. We know what you've done." I tell myself that I don't know what he meant, that I'm innocent. But it's a lie. I've always known. It happened years ago, before I met Alice or Mark or Tom. A car accident, a split-second decision not to stop, not to help, because I was scared. Someone died because of my cowardice, and I buried that memory so deep I almost convinced myself it didn't happen. But Blackridge knew. Now no matter where I go, I feel the weight of it. The faint clinking of chains follows me everywhere, in the dead of night, in quiet hallways, even in my own home. It's not loud, not overt, but it's enough to remind me that I'm not free. Not really. I've started seeing things too. Shadows where there shouldn't be any, faces in the corner of my vision that vanish when I turn. The warden's words echo in my mind. You cannot escape what binds you here. I don't know how long I can live like this. If you're reading this, consider it a warning. Don't go to Blackridge. Don't test what waits there. Because if you do, it will find you, and it will never let go, and neither will your guilt.